Good morning, and welcome to our Wednesday morning coffee with Culture by Choice. So as you can see, I'm in my car this morning because I just did a coffee drop-off to a friend of mine who has been battling COVID, and so I dropped some coffee off at her porch to kind of make her day. It's also 93 degrees outside today, so iced coffee it is instead of hot coffee. Anyway, so last week when we left off in our conversation, we had been talking about communication, or the lack of communication within organizations and potentially between individuals, and why that's happening more so now during this COVID era, if you will. And part of that is really from many of us operating out of survival mode, both individually many times and within our organization. So this week we're going to talk a little bit about some tips on how to improve that communication in order to help your organization move forward and create a better environment of open, honest, and trustworthy communication to help you guys push forward, right? So the first thing that I can tell you when it comes to communication, especially within an organization, is that you really need to have a good plan of how to execute that communication, right? So many times we have best laid plans for projects and different strategic plans, but many times we forget to add in how are we going to communicate that information to our employees, to our organization as a whole. And so, especially during times like now, having a clear mode of communicating to everyone is very important. So what you need to remember when creating that plan is not only do you need to know the what are you communicating, but you need to know how you're going to communicate it. Is it something that needs to be verbal? Is it something that needs to have written communication? Does it need both? Does it need to be in person? You need to have, yes, the what, but also how. And then also you need to have why. Why are you communicating this information, right? So one of the things we hear the most right now is that either there's a lack of communication coming from leadership, or maybe there's an overabundance of communication taking place. Either way, it can be detrimental. So if you're communicating too much information, employees may not be able to decipher what is important, what are we truly supposed to be focusing on. If you're not communicating enough, they feel like there's not enough transparency. Okay, so somewhere in there has to be a happy medium. So if you can create that plan of what you're communicating, how you're going to communicate it, and why you're communicating it, that's very important. Then you also, on top of that, have to understand who is going to be doing the communicating, so that it is a streamlined amount of communication coming from the same source, so that it's all organized in a way that it's one message across the board. Okay, so that's tip number one. Tip number two is if you're asking for some sort of action to take place from your employees, or you're asking them to execute something, you need to have very clear expectations of what you're asking from them. So when you are communicating to them a need or a call to action, you need to be very clear on what those expectations are. And not only be clear on that, you need to pause and you need to ask for understanding, test for their understanding, make sure that they don't have any questions. The testing for the clarification is so important, and it's a step that we many times forget, and then we're left wondering, why didn't they understand what I asked them to do? I communicated this in multiple ways, and yet they still are saying they don't understand what we're asking of them. So don't forget to test for that understanding amongst all of those other things, right? And then the last tip that I can give you, and maybe this is one of the most important things that I can tell anyone about communication, is that to remember, if it is a difficult conversation or if it's an important communication, many times just sending an email or a text is not appropriate. Okay? We need to ensure that we are verbally communicating those important conversations, those difficult conversations, either to the individuals or to the group as a whole. So if you're trying to communicate something very important, maybe it's something difficult that you need to communicate to the entire company. I can tell you the best way to do that is to have a face-to-face or some sort of video conference or a town hall where people can see your face, they can read your body language, and they can hear the inflection in your voice. That is all lost in written communication. Now, once you've done the verbal communication, is a follow-up written communication appropriate? Sure. But if you're trying to communicate something that is difficult or very important, I can't emphasize this enough. Having a verbal conversation with someone or a face-to-face conversation with someone always trumps the written communication, because this allows them to read all of those extra pieces of language that are in your face, in your body, in the sound and intonation of your voice. And then, of course, it also opens up the ability for them to ask questions, ask for clarification. It gives you the chance to test for understanding. So verbal is always the better way to do it when you are trying to communicate something difficult or important. So those are 3 very important tips that I can give you guys. Make sure you have a plan, make sure you're testing for understanding, and make sure that if it's important, that it's face-to-face or it's verbal, so that people can have a better understanding and a better look into what you're trying to communicate. So happy Wednesday. We will talk with you guys next week, and we will continue on with some more great tips for you guys as leaders to be able to implement, especially during these tough times. Have a great day. Bye-bye, everybody.